Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is strike. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or uses of this verb. The first way people use the verb strike is to mean to hit a person or thing with a hand, a weapon, or some other object. A second way we use the verb strike is to mean to cause a match to ignite. So, if you ever have to use those, it's this idea of, right? That's striking a match. A third way we use the verb strike is to mean to occur suddenly and have harmful or damaging effects on something or some group of people. Sometimes we'll hear strike used with natural disasters, particularly when there's not much warning. A fourth way to use this verb strike is to mean to purposely stop work until an employer meets certain demands. I want to note that there are actually many more definitions for this verb strike than just the ones I've identified here. I tried to pick out some of the more common ones I think you might either see when you're reading or hear as you're listening to other people speak. We'll talk about a few more meanings for this verb when we look at phrasal verbs in just a minute. But first, I want to note that strike is an irregular verb. To make the progressive tense, we need to drop the E and then add ing to form striking. The past tense and participle forms of this verb have a spelling change. So we're going to use struck, and that's pronounced struck. Struck. Now let's move on to some phrasal verbs. One phrasal verb you might hear is strike back, and that means to attack or take action against someone or something that has hurt you. Let's look at this phrasal verb in an example sentence. At first, he ignored the verbal attacks, but when things got physical, he struck back. So this is going to connect back as well to our first meaning regarding hitting someone or something. Another phrasal verb you might hear is to strike down. This is used quite a bit when talking about court cases, and as those court cases are appealed or argued at a higher level. So the meaning here is to disallow a law or decision. So let's take a look at an example. The Supreme Court struck down the lower court's ruling. The Supreme Court is the highest national or federal court in the United States, and it has the ability to disallow lower courts' rulings or decisions. Another phrasal verb you might hear is strike out, and this can have a couple different meanings. The first we'll look at is to cross writing out. So if you're a person who likes to make lists and cross things off as you accomplish or complete those tasks, you're using the phrasal verb strike out. So let's look at this in an example sentence. I always strike out completed items on my to-do list. A second meaning for strike out is to mean simply to fail. So let's look at that in a sentence. I tried to get my boss to use my idea, but I struck out. Just another way of saying I failed. My boss didn't use the idea. The last phrasal verb we'll look at is to strike up, and it means to start a conversation, a relationship, or it could mean to start performing music. Let's look at this in an example sentence. He struck up a conversation with me. So that goes to that first meaning there of starting a conversation. And our second sentence will go to the last meaning. When the band struck up, people began to dance. So again, when the band started performing music. Let's continue doing some practice with the verb strike. Today we'll look at simple past tense sentences, present progressive, and present perfect. We'll start with simple past tense. In the affirmative, we want to use the irregular form of our verb, which is struck. This is true no matter what our subject is. We're using simple past tense to talk about an action that was completed at a definite time in the past. Let's look at an affirmative example. The carpenter struck a nail, right? So it's that idea of likely using a hammer, right, to hit the object. To make a negative simple past tense sentence, I'm going to use did not and then the base verb. So again, we changed the spelling now, back away from our irregular. Here's an example sentence. She didn't strike the child. Again, this is going to that meaning of hit. If I want to make a yes or no question in the simple past tense, I want to start with did, then I'll have my subject, and then the base verb. Did you strike up a conversation with anyone in the airport? Next, let's look at present progressive. In this verb tense, we're talking about something that is happening right now or an action that is in progress. To make this verb tense in the affirmative or positive, we're going to use a present form of be, that's am, is, or are, and then we'll use the ing form of the verb. Here's an example sentence. The employees are striking until they get a raise from their company. This is going back to one of the last meanings we looked at for this verb. So this is an important strategy that organized groups of labor, you might hear the term unions, use to try and get employers to agree to their demands or perhaps sometimes make changes that will help their working conditions. If I want to make a negative sentence in the present progressive, I need to insert not after the be verb. You might hear native speakers use the contractions isn't or aren't when they're doing this, but you're not going to hear a contraction with am not. One just doesn't exist. Here's an example sentence. The troops are striking back against the enemy. Lastly, if I want to make a yes or no question in the present progressive, I will start with my present form of be, then I'll have my subject, and then the ing form of the verb. Here's an example. Are the athletes striking for Black lives? In the present perfect, we'll be describing an action that either started in the past and continues into the present, or an action that was completed some point in the past, but we really don't know when. We call that sometimes the indefinite past. So let's take a look at an affirmative sentence. You're going to see here I'm using have or has and then the participle form of the verb. Max Scherzer has struck out more than 3,000 hitters. So you're going to hear this word strike used often if you watch Major League Baseball. It's an important part of the game. So this sentence is connecting to Major League Baseball. Max Scherzer is a professional baseball player. And you might be thinking, well, we went over strikeout and you didn't say anything about baseball. But remember, strikeout means fail. So in baseball, a hitter is trying to hit the ball. But if it doesn't happen, they have failed. So that really kind of connects back to our phrasal verb, strike out. If I want to make a negative present perfect sentence, I'm going to continue with have or has to start, then I'll insert not, then the participle form of the verb. Here's an example. Natural disasters haven't struck the island in many years. Finally, if I want to ask a question in the present perfect, I'm going to start with have or has, then I'll have the subject, and then the participle form of the verb. Here's an example. Have you struck the match yet? Next, let's look at some words that are related to our verb strike. And the first word you'll notice has the exact same spelling, and it's going to have the exact same pronunciation as our verb. It's just the noun form of the word. And the noun form of strike also has many different meanings. I've picked out just a couple that, again, I think you're more likely to hear. A strike could be a sudden attack. Here's an example of that. Has the military planned the next strike? Again, we could insert the word attack there, and it would have really the same meaning. A strike could also be a refusal to work that's organized by a body of employees as a form of protest. Again, connects back to the earlier verb we talked about. Here's an example of that. It's the third day of the union's strike. You might also hear the noun form striker. And again, this could connect back to meaning an employee who is on strike. So here's an example of that. Strikers are demanding higher wages. But you might also hear the word striker used in the sport of soccer. And that's to describe somebody who's playing the position of forward, or sometimes is referred to as an attacker. So here's an example of that. He plays striker for the team. The last word we're going to look at today is the adjective striking. And again, this should look familiar to you. It's also the progressive form or continuous form of our verb. But striking as an adjective can mean attracting attention by reason of being unusual, extreme, noticeable, or good looking. So if it helps you to think about like how these are connected, imagine, right, seeing something very unusual, extreme, noticeable, good looking, and it's sort of like you've been hit. So here's an example of striking as an adjective in a sentence. There are striking similarities between the two books. So there are unusual or noticeable similarities between these two books. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great